Hello, I'm Dr. James Gilly. In this module of American National Government, we're going to be examining Article 1 of the Constitution of the United States of America, looking at the United States Congress and where they get their power from, how they operate, and generally speaking, what they do. So let's go ahead and just dive right on in. Article 1 of our Constitution is what actually goes about creating a legislature. Right? The very first thing that our founding fathers were concerned with when they were building their institutions was giving power most directly to the people, right? Creating a legislature that could be responsible to the population of the United States. Now, in thinking about how to do this, they actually were even more concerned with dividing up power as much as possible. So Article 1 of our Constitution creates two separate parts of our legislature. One overall Congress divided into two parts. A House of Representatives, which is meant to be much more directly responsive and tied to the people themselves. It's meant to be a body of change. And the Senate, which originally, right, in the original version of the Constitution, was meant to represent the states, right? This was to balance power between the states on one hand and the people on the other. Now, this eventually gets changed by the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, wherein we directly elect our senators. But we're going to mostly keep it to the original conception of the Constitution at this point. So what we ended up creating is something called a bicameral legislature, right? That means two houses, right? This divides up power even within the legislature itself. So the powers that actually get created and granted to Congress, right? Congress is actually granted its powers within Article 1 of the Constitution. And it's given a whole lot of what we call enumerated powers. These are the powers that actually get their own article within the, not article, but sub point within the Constitution. They actually get numbered. That's why we call them the enumerated powers of the Constitution, or the numbered powers. The first big power granted to Congress in the Constitution is that power to tax, right? This is a direct response to the issues that arose in Shays' Rebellion under the Articles of Confederation, right? Congress didn't really have the ability to raise funds to operate a government. So the very first thing that our founding fathers did once they created a legislature is they gave it power to raise money, right? It could raise, borrow, and make money for the country, so it's able to do things. They're also granted, in large part, the ability to regulate commerce, right? The various sorts of things that fall under the economy, making sure the states follow the way that power is supposed to be distributed within Congress, by Congress, right? So the states have to follow the dictates of Congress when it comes to the economy. And in large part, right, Congress is granted this ability to regulate commerce, especially via the Interstate Commerce Clause, which we'll probably come back to in a little bit. Congress was also granted the ability to unify and expand our country. So this includes things like making roads, adding new states, creating a postal service, right? Any sort of thing that helps to bring our country together and make it a larger country. Those powers are granted to Congress. And also in relationship to one of the other branches of government, Congress is granted the ability to create the federal judiciary, right? As we'll see in a couple of modules, the judiciary itself in Article 3 of the Constitution only refers very strictly to a Supreme Court. So instead, right, power is granted to Congress, right, to create this federal judiciary. So let's dig in a little bit into the institution that is Congress. Right. What we've ended up creating is what we call a bicameral institution, right? As we already mentioned, that is a two-house legislature. And the way that we've created and go about electing members to these houses greatly influences the way that they're functioning. Right. So our House of Representatives, which is in its very core meant to be a much more representative institution, representing the state, well, not the states, but the people directly, right? It's meant to be a much more change-oriented sort of political system, much more responsive to changes within the population's public opinion. So they actually members of the House of Representatives have to stand for election every 2 years, right? Every 2 years, they're going to actually have to go up for re-election. There's no rolling terms, right? Every time they have to go up for re-election. We've kind of by tradition created a 425 member or 425 district Congress, right? And this is apportioned or broken up based on population. We talked a little bit about this in the last module when we talked about gerrymandering and how they would draw up safe seats. But these districts are created, and there's only 425 of them, and they are distributed based on populations within the states. Now, once you get into the House of Congress, right? Once you get into the House of Representatives, you'll find that there's a very hierarchical style of leadership, right? They have very strong leaders in the House. The chief of these leaders is the Senate, sorry, not the Senate majority, they're the Speaker of the House, right? They're the number one big dog. They're the ones that run the House of Representatives, right? They distribute amongst the parties, right, the party leadership. And we see once you also break that down into committees, the committees themselves are also very hierarchically minded, right? The power is held by the committee leaders. So what we see within the House of Representatives is that the party that's in majority is really the party that's driving the system, right? They're driving things forward. We see that the majority itself decides, right, within the Rules Committee, which bills are going to get to the floor, right, and then how those bills are going to be discussed once they're on the floor. There's usually very strict closed rules, and you can't add amendments, you can't really debate, you're just voting on things up and down. We also see that the House of Representatives is the main body for doing revenue sorts of things within our government. And as previously mentioned, right, any sort of amendments to bills actually have to be approved before the bill gets voted on. Right? So there are very strict rules within the House of Representatives. Because it's larger, because it's meant to be tied to the people a little bit more, we see a much more hierarchical rules-based institution. But it also has much more turnover. It's also meant to be the more powerful house out of these two, whereas the Senate's meant to be kind of a slow deliberative sort of body. And to reflect that, right, we actually see that senators are elected every 6 years. They're meant to be a little bit further away from political changes, right? And we see that every 2 years, about a third of the Senate gets turned over. The Senate is granted 2 members per state, so there's 50 states. That leads us to 100 senators right now. Now, within the Senate, power is much more weakly distributed. Right, it ends up being distributed power even within committees. Right, there's a unanimous consent. Right, everyone in the Senate actually has to agree to hear a vote on a legislation. Right, so this can really slow the process down. Right, because only one senator, a single senator, has the power to stop any sort of voting process. So within this system, we see that amendments to bills are allowed, right? There's a lot more kind of horse trading, politicking going on the Senate side of things. There's also a lot more flexibility on the limits of debate. You can change things on the floor. You can, right? Everyone is allowed to debate these things, as opposed to a much closer time period and closed sort of debate within the House of Representatives. Now, these flexible limits on debate on the Senate side lead to kind of 2 of the major big features of debate within the Senate. The first being filibuster, right? And that's that ability for one senator to stand up and keep speaking to kind of run out the clock on whether something's going to be voted on. Now, to stop the filibuster, right, that requires 60 votes, and that's something called cloture. So these are kind of 2 sides to the same coin. But this really shows that there is a lot of power for individual senators, right? These senators wield much more power, and they are really heavily meant to debate, whereas the House of Representatives is much more, let's push through legislation, try to see what people want, reflect what our populations want. The Senate's meant to kind of slow the process down. So even within the Congress, there's these 2 different tensions, one pushing everything forward, more change-oriented, tied to the people, and the other one's much slower, meant to really slow down the process within the Senate, right? Meant to equally represent all of the states. So this is one, dividing up power, right? Checks and balances. This is also showing a little bit of federalism, right? A little bit of the power to the states, a little bit of power to the people, really balancing things out. So let's take a little bit deeper look into organization here, right? The way that power is actually divided within the legislature. If you'll see above me, there's a nifty little chart, right, to help you keep things straight. The House of Representatives represents the lower house, and typically, right, across nationally, we see that the lower house is the much more important house. It's the one that really drives the political process. So the leader of the House of Representatives is the majority leader, who also serves as the Speaker of the House. Right, this person who runs the majority party serves as the Speaker of the House, right, that runs the entire show. And underneath them, right, there's either the majority floor leader, who's kind of their captain on the floor, or the minority leader, who runs, right, the people who are not in charge of the government, right, runs the minority. And under each of those are the kind of the lieutenants who go around and, right, drive the legislative process, right, the whips. They're the ones that do the counting, the head counting, seeing who's going to vote for what they need to get for their district in order to be able to vote for other things. So this, right, is really the way that the Congress works. It's much more hierarchical. Now, if you look at the Senate on the other column, which is the upper house, right, the person who's in charge of running the Senate is actually the Vice President of the United States, not a member of the Senate. But they are allowed to break ties, and they run the system from the Senate, right, as the Vice President. Underneath that is the President pro tempore, who's the highest ranking member of the majority party. And underneath him you have majority minority leaders. That's where really the politicking takes place. And under that you also have Senate whips. There's only 100 senators, so they're really given a lot more authority within this system. Now, so on the really hierarchical House of Representatives side of things, but the party caucuses play a huge role in how this system works. So it's really the parties that are distributing membership to the various committees that are really organizing this system. Right? And the whips kind of, wield the whip and try to keep everyone working in the direction that the majority leaders want. Now, the most important of all of the committees, right, we've kind of been talking about these committees a little bit. The most important committee for the House of Representatives is the Rules Committee. This is the committee that gives you what they call the ticket, right, that gives you the ability to hear legislation on the floor, right, on the House floor. And they also determine whether there's open or closed rules. Open rules mean it's free for debate, and everyone can have their say, and they can also add amendments on the floor. Whereas closed rules, which are really the way the system has been operating over the last 20 to 30 years, right? These closed rules are very, very tight, right? No debate allowed, no amendments allowed, up or down vote right on the floor. So the House is a much more hierarchical, rules-based system, right? The Senate, on the other hand, really, it's like trying to herd cats, right? The cat sitting right off the camera, right? It'd be like trying to herd a whole bunch of the cats, get them to do what you want them to do. They're really very independent creatures within the Senate. They kind of just do what they're going to want to do, and it's much more difficult to get them all working in the same direction. Now, what we also observe are within the various parties, you have what we call our member caucuses. And these actually run across party lines and are much more about interest within the system. So, right, there's identity-based ones like House Latino Caucus, House the Black Caucus, and these can also run across chambers as well. There's the House Freedom Caucus, right, which is much more ideological. There's interest-based ones like the House, well, not the House Space Caucus, but the Space Caucus, the people interested in space things. The Veterans Caucus for all those veterans that are serving. The House Lawyer Caucus, well, not the House Lawyer Caucus, but the Congressional Lawyer Caucus, sorry. All these C words running together, right? All the lawyers coming together, or the medical professionals, all three of those, or the engineers, all, well, I guess that's just Thomas Massey all on his own, right? But these member caucuses also allow for legislation to kind of originate based on varied interests within the political system. So, right, the structures within our institutions really vary across the institutions, but also kind of reflect each other. We were just talking about these committees. These are the primary force of politics within the Congress, right? The committee structure is really, really important to how things operate within both the House and the Senate. Sorry. Right. So what we see is that there's really three major kinds of committees within the system, right? There's our standing committees, which are legally obligated to always exist. There's select committees, which deal with, right, kind of upcoming issues, and there's special or joint committees, or the conference committee, which are kind of study groups for routine matters, or that try to bring together, right, House or Senate bills. So let's take a look at this. So there's kind of a handful of what we call our standing committees across the houses of Congress, right, on the Senate side and the House side. These standing committees are things like Rules and Administration, which are the ones that actually pick the bills that are going to be heard. This is a really important committee, right? It also, right, makes sure that the behavior of Congress members is the way it's supposed to be. There's the Budget Committee, which, right, decides where the money is going to go. There are authorizing committees that really do a whole lot of functioning of the executive, right? They help the executive to get their job done. There's the Appropriations Committee, which actually grabs that money and gets it where it needs to go. The Revenue Committee, which always has to stand, which figures out how the money is going to come in. And then you've got your Oversight Committees, which are the ones that oversee the functioning of various parts of the government. So like a House Armed Forces Oversight Committee oversees the functioning of the Pentagon, the House Intelligence Committee or the Senate Intelligence Committee, seeing, right, how the intelligence community does its job, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Agriculture Committee, Science and Technology Committees, right? They oversee parts of our federal government. Joint committees up top are put together to kind of study bigger issues. So like a joint committee on climate change, joint committee on peaceful uses of outer space. I always go back to the space stuff. Joint committee on 9/11, right? That was a big one. So these joint committees really just kind of study stuff or do kind of routine sorts of deals. And then you've got the Conference Committee that exists to take the different bills that come out of the House and the Senate and make them into one unified piece of law. But we'll get to that in a couple of modules when we do the policy process. So don't worry too much about that Conference Committee right now or how these actually do the policy process. We'll handle that a little bit later. We just want to look at the institutions in this module. So the role and process of the legislature, right? So there's a bunch of different things we need to think about when we're thinking about how the legislature goes about doing its job. So the first big thing we really need to talk about is what actually is the job of a legislator, right? What are they meant to be doing? Well, first and foremost, perhaps the biggest and most relevant job of the legislature for us is that they represent constituents, right? The people that live in the districts they represent, that's their job. They're meant to deal with constituent issues. So if you've got a problem, if your grandma's not getting her Social Security checks, you go talk to your congressman. That's their job, right? Their job is to make sure the people are heard within their district. Right? Some members of government very much pride themselves on their constituent services. Others, right, they're just kind of there to do the party job, and that's mostly what their constituents want. There's a lot of good examples of how this works. Right? Some constituents, right, really don't want much, so they let their people go do party politics. Right? A good example of that was Charlie Wilson back in the 1980s. Other people want their representatives to really do the work for them in Washington, D.C. Garrett Graves, Louisiana 6th District, is very good at constituent services. So that's why he keeps getting reelected. So that's kind of two big different ways of doing this, but it is representing the people. Another big job of legislators is to debate and pass legislation, right? That seems kind of right on the face of it what they're supposed to be doing, but it's a little bit more complicated than that, or really it's become more complicated than that. Maybe it shouldn't be. But what we see is that, right, it is actually the job of the legislature to govern, right, to pass legislation when necessary, and to debate and to think about it. But we're seeing a lot of this process, right, a lot of this legislative process, writing of laws, get kind of outsourced to think tanks. And we'll talk about that when we get to the policy process in about 3 modules. So what you do need to be aware of, though, is that, right, it is at its heart the job of the legislature to legislate, to write rules and laws. Now, the way that they do this also varies, right? There's 2 big approaches, 2 big principles of how this representation should occur, right? When you elect a representative, are they a delegate or are they a trustee? Right, under the delegate view, when you elect a representative, right, they are supposed to go and do their job on behalf of you, right? They literally, you have given your legislative authority, your ability, right, part of your sovereignty to this legislator. And then they're supposed to take, right, what your vote would be and do that, right? They're supposed to reflect the views and beliefs of their constituents, right? That's this delegate role, right? That's the delegate conception of a legislator. On the other hand, right, there's this trustee view of legislation, right, of legislators. And that's, right, you're electing the person. They're not just there to, right, pass on and hold your vote. They're there because you trust them, right, to make the best possible decision, right? That's that trust part of trustee, right? So they're free to vote however they believe, because they believe that they as the person are there as a representative of you, right? And they're not directly representing you. You trust them to vote for you. And that's a subtle but really important difference in how legislators are supposed to do their jobs. The trustee view has pretty much fallen out of favor, right? At this point, the main view on legislation, or the job of a legislator, is that they are primarily supposed to be delegates. But that's just kind of how things have emerged. And that's the popular view now. And in America, that's predominantly been the popular view of the role of a legislator. So when it comes to the political process, however, there's really 3 main things you need to look at. First is this idea of vote trading, right? In order for people to get the things that they want passed, they're supposed to go and, right, trade votes on different things with other legislators to make sure they get a majority to vote for it. Right? This is called the log rolling process, pushing these logs, right, that are bills, through the process, by pushing them through, by rolling them along, and making sure everybody kind of gets what they want. But this can change the shape of legislation, right? This can turn something like, hey, we appreciate the service of this one person, into a whole lot of other amendments just coming dangling off of it, right? Like a Christmas tree. And we call these Christmas tree bills, where it's one tiny piece of legislation with all sorts of other appropriations and whatnot attached to it, like a Christmas tree. That one kind of makes sense. And ultimately, what's attempting to happen here is that people are attempting to deliver the pork, right, the goods, back to their constituents, right? Pork barrel politics is this notion of building up politics of everybody just kind of paying each other off to get the system, right, pay off the little things that everybody wants. Like, so if I want a tortilla factory to get supported in my district, right, I might trade for, like, research on cat influenza in another district, right? We trade those sorts of things, and that's how that ends up becoming big omnibus spending sorts of bills. But hopefully their staffs will keep this under check, right, under control. Right? The staff really plays an important role within the workings of a congressperson, be it in the Senate or the House, right? The most important is the chief of staff, who really keeps the legislator on their, right, appropriate path, and also helps serve as a gatekeeper to make sure only the people that really need to be getting to the legislator themselves are able to get there, right, and right, kind of prioritizing policy sorts of decisions. The rest of the staff is meant to kind of fill a support role to help the legislator in their business, right, with the jobs that they're trying to do, right, to hear constituent needs and right to kind of push things forward. So the staff really plays an important role within the system. Right, they're the ones that both help the congressperson do their job as well as keep the congressperson on track and make sure the things that need to get brought to the congressperson's attention do that. And they kind of do a little bit of triage, a little bit of gatekeeping in order to do that. Now, big question, ethics within Congress. There is a lot of money involved in this system and a lot of lobbying involved in this system trying to change the minds of legislators. So there are questions about how much influence lobbyists should be able to have on congresspeople. And generally speaking, over the last 20 years or so, we've tried to ratchet back the access that lobbyists have had, the amount of money that they can put in. But with the Citizens United ruling, right, that amount of money has gone way up, allowing for lobbyists, right, through their political action committees to really drive this process forward. We've also seen a rise in the ability of lobbyists to just write legislation and put it directly into the system themselves, right, through these congresspeople. So it used to be that congresspeople would spend all the time with their staffs writing legislation, but now they generally receive them kind of in whole cloth, right, fully formed from lobbying groups and think tanks. And this has really kind of changed the game in how Congress functions. This almost mutes the role of constituents and the ability we have to keep our elected officials accountable. One of the things we see is that, generally speaking, people don't like Congress. Congress gets very low approval ratings, in the 17 to 20% range, just to keep that, and sometimes even lower, right? Pew and Reuters do some interesting polling on this. And they find that Congress is about as popular as stepping in cat vomit or Nickelback, right? That's about how popular Congress is, which is not very popular. Not very popular at all. But individual Congress people generally have higher than 50% approval ratings. So how do you keep Congress accountable when you don't like the body as a whole, but you do like your individual, right? The only way you could change the whole thing would be by everyone throwing out their individual representative, who they all generally like. So that, right, really makes it difficult to keep Congress accountable. And the way, right, this mismatch between constituent views over their congressperson and the view of Congress as a whole, that creates a lot of problems, right? That creates a lot of difficulties in keeping things accountable. So we're about to move on, and the last section we've got here, I'm going to call it a little bit of soapbox time, me getting up on my soapbox. But this gets to some of the larger questions about Congress's role, especially over the last 30 years. Generally speaking, over the last 30 years, or really expanding that to the entire century, right, the last 100 years or so, Congress has given up a lot of its power to the presidency. They're just not doing their jobs. They have taken a lot of things that are congressional authority and just let the executive do it, right? And this has the side effect of making the president much, much more powerful, right? Almost moving towards the imperial presidency, which we will talk about in the next module. And by ratcheting up the power of the president, this also ratchets up the power of the judiciary, right, to check each other, with Congress largely speaking playing more of a background role. And this really is tied in heavily with the notion of polarization, right, with political polarization. The more that the parties play a bigger role, the less that Congress actually wants to do, because they're concerned about the next election, not about actually governing. And so while the internal political process has become more and more polarized, you see fewer and fewer people actually say, oh, I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican. They might vaguely have feelings one way or the other, but there is a lot of de-affiliation, important term, going on, right? People not feeling tied to either political party, right? So as the majority of the population in the U.S. doesn't feel represented by either of the two main political parties, this is going to call, but at the same time, these two political parties play larger and larger roles within the political system. This is going to create a lot of problems moving forward, and this gives more and more power to parts of the government that weren't meant to have it. Right? Congress is supposed to be the closest thing to the people, and it no longer really is. It has given up most of its power to the other branches. So Congress is kind of there as just like a rubber stamp almost, and Congress isn't doing anything. Well, it does some things, right? It does a lot of things, but it's not governing the way it's meant to govern, right? While gridlock is a feature of this political system, it is a feature of dividing up government as much as we have. It's almost like it's become too much, right? There's a point at when gridlock is no longer a feature. It is essentially created a toxic political system. So Congress, again, has become deeply, deeply unpopular, but people enjoy their individual congressperson. So how do we balance all of these things, right? How do we get Congress back on track? And that's an open question. I don't have a good answer for it, but it is something we need to think about. And I think it's going to be really important to think about as we move into our next module concerning the presidency. So that's where I'm going to leave you for. That's where I'm going to leave you for this afternoon, for this module. So I'm going to bid you farewell, and I will see you in the next module where we talk about the president. So thank you very much.